sretna pod suncem, rasti u jaslama dječjim, rasti i cvjetaj zemljo radnih ljudi, i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napuči i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Над страной весенний ветер веет, каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как небесную родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать.
Святом
din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și sfut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut.
Blackpool with the uncomfortable knowledge that the miners' strike appears to have damaged his opinion poll rating. Mr. Kinnock said it was quite probable that he would be meeting the Miners' Union President Arthur Scargill during the weekend. How did he react to Lord Whitelaw's demand that he should tell Mr. Scargill to give instructions to stop miners' violence on the picket line?
Lord Whitelaw would be better keeping his advice for the Prime Minister. She obviously is sadly in need of that advice because she simply doesn't understand the issues at stake, and she's willing to let this country go on building up bills, now nearly £2 billion.
Hey now Tommy, have you got a new shirt? Is its colour a fine bright blue? Has your mother sent you off to your school from the street with a pretty view? Shall we wrestle in the old schoolyard like the other children do? You can scuff your shoes, you can tear your hands, and they'll rip that shirt off you. Hey now Tommy, since you moved away, they've taken our town and they made it new. Now there stands a chemical plant where the cherry orchards grew. And I married Lucy from the back of our class, who once wrote letters to you. We've got kids and we send them to school from the street with a pretty view. Oh, and your shirt of blue. Oh, and your shirt of blue. Too quick from the fields where the flowers strew, from a butterfly stick to a ballad and a brick, changing uniforms far too soon. minutes at the colliery, you in your shirt of blue. Shall we wrestle in the muddy patch like the other poor men do? We can scuff our boots, we can tear our hands, and I'll rip that shirt off you. Oh, in your shirt of blue. Oh, in your shirt of blue. Oh, Benny, Tommy, who you grew up to drink from the fields where the flowers grow. From a butterfly stick to a batter and a brick, changing uniforms far too soon.
As several pickets were hauled away, eventually into waiting police vans.
Oh, in your shirt of blue. 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 Oh, in your shirt of blue.
Hello everybody and welcome to the program. It is a Friday, it is the 27th of September 2024 and you join us today for a Q&A live stream. We've had a few interesting questions come in over the last few weeks really, and so I'll be turning to those. I hope you enjoyed the brief diversion away from the usual soundtrack. I am going to be working on, as I said yesterday, new soundtracks for the introductions to various programs over the next few days. So that's the last time you'll hear the classic one, but there will be a... hang on, we apparently have a microphone problem. Let me just check where we are. Right. Bear with me a moment. Right, is that any better sound-wise? I made the mistake of plugging the mic into a multiple USB socket when it needed its own socket. Apparently it's rather sensitive to that. So, okay, that's the reason why we were having problems there. So, today, Q&A episode. We've got a few interesting questions that have come in, and we'll be working our way through those, getting responses, etc. So, I'll get straight into it. The first question that came in was a comment that was made originally in the chat, and I asked the commenter in question to email it to me. And they have done. So the first question is as follows. I'm curious about communist Afghanistan, what its flaws were and what its strengths were, and whether the Soviet war was justified. It was. Did they really go too fast? Questionable. How fast is too fast? The Soviets advised them to go slower, but was that due to revisionism in the Soviet Union? Could the war have been won if it weren't for the treachery of Gorbachev? There's a lot there to get into, but let's first of all deal with what actually happened. What the questioner there is referring to is the period known as the product of the Saur Revolution, which is spelt in English S-A-U-R. And this was the product of an uprising staged by the PDPA, People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, which was based in the officer corps of the old Afghan army, and in the what consisted then of the Afghan intelligentsia and the very, very small Afghan proletariat. They took power in, I believe it was 1977, I think. I'll just check that detail. But they took power in the very late 1970s, in 1978, in actual fact. And it was much like many officer corps and intelligentsia uprisings that took place throughout the post-war World War II period, was the product of a minority in Afghanistan, just as the Baathists in Syria and Iraq and other places were. These were minority uprisings. They didn't come to power through similar routes as like obviously the October Revolution or the Chinese Revolution. These were officer corps revolts, which were progressive in their nature due to the agenda that they had, the officers' movement had when they came to power. But they were very much minorities. Now, the Soviet intervention, when it came at the request of the Afghan government. But the Afghan government itself was, to be honest, something of a chaotic it was a bit of a mess. The various personalities at the top of it were infighting amongst each other. There was the assassination of one of the key leaders, Hafizullah Amin, which the accounts I've read blame the Soviets for sending in a Spetsnaz unit to kill him. Others blame internal wrangling inside the Afghan leadership itself. Either way, from the very beginnings, it was unstable. It had a problem in that because it was the product of a tiny proletariat and an intelligentsia, many of whom were foreign trained, and didn't have much of a foothold, or certainly nowhere near enough of a foothold in the great peasant masses of Afghanistan. And one of its ongoing problems that it never shook really, although it did make some progress, was that it was never able to get enough of a foothold in the peasantry to pull off a long-lasting revolution. That, I think, was the key weakness. And it tried various things. It tried, of course, land reform, because the landed estates in Afghanistan have been controlled by the same families for many, many decades, many hundreds of years. And it did promise land reform, but of course, you can't drive land reform without a peasant base, without the peasants buying into it. And the problem that they had consistently was that the peasants still remained tied to the reactionary feudal landlord class in Afghanistan. Some went over to the side of the revolution, but not enough. Now, as to the Soviet intervention, it wasn't imperialism, no matter what the Trotskyites tell you. They were responding to a request from the Afghan revolutionary government, however flawed that government might have been. Was it a mistake to go in? I would argue, well, certainly it looks like a mistake when you view the war through the Western lens in the end. The actual military campaign itself, though, bears closer examination, and that takes more time than I have available to me tonight. What I will say, though, is it might have been a mistake to go in as they did, to essentially take over the management of the war. I mean, the original idea, I think, was that they were going to train the new Afghan army and have that do the fighting. But the Soviets got pulled into doing a lot of the fighting themselves. However, the way in which this is portrayed in the West was that the Soviets lost to this great resistance of the Afghan peasantry. Now, it's true that the Afghan government didn't win the peasantry over to their side, but what is also true is that an awful lot of the fighting, but by no means the bulk of it, but a huge significant proportion of it, was done by an international legion of various reactionary Islamic groups that the US funded and armed. As we all know, our old friend, a certain Mr. Bin Laden, was involved with this. Now, were the Soviets losing the war? That's another question. There are different arguments about this. For a long time, the only accounts I could find were Western accounts, which all, whether they were from the left or the right, doesn't make much difference. They were all claiming that the Soviets were losing the war, and it was a key reason why the Soviet Union collapsed. Having read some, admittedly, machine translations of Russian accounts, I'm now not sure that that is true. I think that, I saw Scott Ritter make the claim that the Soviets were actually starting to turn the corner on the war by about 86, 87, and that they were actually starting to cut off the supply of weaponry into Afghanistan coming from Pakistan. But that Gorbachev, this was one of the many things that Gorbachev capitulated over in order to, get whatever it was that he was after. More on him later. So the fact is, though, that the reason why the Afghan revolution failed wasn't because the Soviet military failed. I don't think they did. I think the Soviet military, and by the way, the military they built, fared a hell of a lot better and performed longer under more pressure than the Americans did. The Afghan army that the Soviets trained and armed lasted 3 years after the Soviet withdrawal, so up to about 1992. Because however flawed and how much of a minority it was that fought that revolution, the Afghan revolution was a real thing for many hundreds of thousands of Afghans, and so those people were prepared to continue fighting for it. The problem again, though, was that without purchase within the peasant masses, it's hard to sustain anything. And if you've left the peasant masses to be tied to the reactionary landlord class, then your revolution's going to struggle a great deal. And I think that is the key reason why it failed. The peasants were consistently and successfully manipulated by the landlords and herded into an alliance with the US imperialist mercenary forces. But it would be wrong to say that the Soviets lost it militarily. I don't think they did. I think they did a hell of a lot better than the Americans did, principally because they had far more popular support than the Americans did. Could they have won? It's difficult to say. I mean, could that terrorist campaign be run by the reactionaries be sustained without US support? Maybe on a much lower level. But again, I think the reason for the Soviet withdrawal was a deliberate capitulation by Gorbachev. He would have probably said, "Oh, the Americans lied to me," but I think it was a calculated capitulation designed to deliver the maximum amount of humiliation to the Soviet army. Now I'm thinking about it, I think militarily it wasn't a loss. Politically, it was a loss because of the lack of progress with the peasants. Gorbachev's so-called deal, I think, was again designed to deliver maximum humiliation to the Soviet armed forces. I think that's what that was about. So we probably need to could probably do with doing an hour on this, but I think that the flaws in the PDPA is the biggest problem. The fact that it never successfully went beyond its origins within the intelligentsia and like upper echelons of the old Afghan army. That's the biggest reason why it failed. I don't think it was a Soviet military failure. Like many other things in that period of time, it was a calculated sellout by the rat in the Kremlin. So, moving on then to our next question. And this comes from Comrade Jason, who asks us the following. What is the Marxist-Leninist understanding of the death penalty? I understand that the death penalty was and is used in former and current communist states, but is there a foundation in Marxist-Leninist theory on its use? I would say that the analysis of this is that the death penalty is a tool. It is a tool of justice systems, and this is, in terms of the way we view it, we have to view it in class terms. That's the way I would say. In terms of our position right now in Britain, or if you're in the United States, your position now, Marxist-Leninists should oppose like imperialist states, bourgeois states, but particularly imperialist states bringing in or bringing back the death penalty. We should definitely oppose it here, because quite simply, why on earth would we want this rotten, decaying, ultra-reactionary state to be able to put us to death legally? Given all that we know about the system and its so-called conception of justice, we should be absolutely and vehemently opposed to this system run by this bourgeoisie giving itself the power to execute people for crimes which we know very well their police have framed people for over and over and over again. If we'd have still had the death penalty in Britain, or many men and some women who have been unjustly convicted of murder would have been executed. So I'm thinking like Birmingham 6, Guildford 4 would definitely have been executed if they'd had the death penalty. There's countless others, men who were coerced into confessions by the charming members of the police forces of Britain and the occupied 6 counties of Ireland, beating confessions out of them, torturing them. So in terms of this system and what the bourgeois justice system is designed to do, which is of course to slap a label of justice on the defence of bourgeois property rights, we must absolutely oppose its reintroduction. I'm sure somebody in the Tory leadership race is going to flirt with the idea for a while. I don't think it's on the cards for now, because I don't think the bourgeois regard it as necessary at this stage. It's something that they might want to indulge in the future, though. Now, how would that change if we were in a workers' state? And here we have to extend, should we say, widen our lens of analysis. Again, like I'll go back to what I initially said. The death penalty is a tool, just like prisons are a tool. Armies are a tool. They are something for which the bourgeois express their power and defend their property rights. If we are in a workers' state and we reform armies, and we unfortunately will have to make usage of prisons, then the system changes, the justice system changes, because of the class basis of it changes. The class basis of it changes to being a defense of proletarian power. Now, the historical example of the Bolsheviks, and again, this analysis is borne out by the work done by Domenico Lacerdo in his book, Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend. In the early period after the revolution, the Bolsheviks tried to take a light touch approach to political enemies. Lacerdo quotes Anne Applebaum, of all people, who confesses in one of her writings that in the early days, the reactionaries mocked the Bolsheviks because they said, oh, these guys can't organize anything. They can't even repress us properly, because the regime in the prison was pretty lax. It was pretty free in terms of what the prisoners could do. The notorious Gulag system doesn't come in until much later. And why, and as does the reintroduction or the introduction of the death penalty in the new system. And why is that? It happens because, of course, of the severity of the situation the revolutionaries found themselves in, and the severity of the attacks on them, the constant plots by internal groups of counter-revolutionaries and traitors. And it's no good being lenient to your enemies if they're constantly and remorselessly attacking you. And this is the reason why the Cheka is formed, which goes on to become the NKVD. This is the reason why the prison system was made more harsh, though nowhere near as cartoonishly brutal as Alexander Solzhenitsyn describes it as. It's why ultimately the death penalty was brought in. Because when you've got enemies of the revolution carrying out massacres, carrying out, encouraging invasions from foreign enemies, really there's no other way to treat these people in the end, because treating them leniently wasn't working. Then you have to take, ultimately you have to take a harsh line on them. So here's the question for us in Britain today. Would we find ourselves in a situation where to defend proletarian power, to defend a workers' state, it would be necessary to bring in a similar type of prison regime and ultimately have the ultimate sanction of the death penalty there, for at least for a while? It may be necessary in the future. It may be necessary to take harsh measures to defend the conquest of power by the proletariat. And that's how we should view it. I know that many, and I did myself for a long time, take what I would call a sort of liberal moralist stance on this. But again, the only analysis that makes sense is the class analysis. For instance, I know that the Chinese, I know we've debated their system before, but they still have the death penalty, and they apply it to sometimes corporate executives. Now, often it has to be said that when a corporate executive is sentenced to a long time in jail and the death penalty bit is usually dropped on appeal. And usually he just does like 20 years inside, which is, of course, 20 years more than any corporate executive would do under a capitalist system, under the system of imperialism. But they do execute people there. And I think that the ones that they execute are similar to the way the Bolsheviks did it, really. Similar to the way that the Chinese revolutionaries did it back in the 40s and 50s, which is they execute people who are traitors and enemies of the state. And that has taken the form of, in recent years, since the coming to power of Xi Jinping as General Secretary and President, an awful lot of people who were caught carrying out espionage on behalf of US imperialism, the British and the other Western powers. That's why the CIA and MI6 whined so much that their networks got wound up, because a lot of these guys, the biggest offenders, were caught, tried in secret, and executed for treason. So we turn to our own situation. Would we do similar? I mean, I don't want to say yes or no here, but like, it would be something that we wouldn't take off the table, because you might need to do it. If you've got people encouraging, if we reach the point where the British working class has become powerful enough and well organised enough to take power, are we really going to say that we're going to leave working class power undefended, that we're not willing to take the harshest of measures to defend it, that we're going to go hands off and be nice to enemies which we know very well will be absolutely merciless on us? In my view, that would be a very foolish decision to rule that out. So to answer the comrade's question, there's no Marxist-Leninist theory on it as a sort of a generalized principle. It's seen in the same way that prisons and policing of certain kinds is viewed, which is, yes, it would be part of a much different system, but it ultimately is a tool which we may wish to avail ourselves of should the situation be serious enough to require it. And that is how I would view it. Right. Our comrade asks another question. A second question regarding a certain aforementioned wretched traitor, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. If, Jason asks, as you have stated many times in your broadcasts, he was so uneducated in Marxist-Leninist theory and so feckless as a politician, how was he able to rise to the very top of the CPSU, Communist Party of the Soviet Union? Now that is, of course, an excellent question, and it is one which I am still working on. because it is. I think I've got a roughly satisfactory answer for the comrade's question, but I'm still unsatisfied in some respects with my own knowledge of this, because I think there's always, as an email I received recently from a regular viewer in Moscow, there's still more coming out about this period. But let's deal with the most pertinent part of this question first, which is, how was a man so theoretically and organizationally inept, even if we just take him at face value and don't look into the wider questions of, well, was he an asset for somebody else? So, but how was he able to become General Secretary of the CPSU? Was his record in other posts that good? I mean, the accounts I've read of the man say that he was a good bullshit artist. Like, I think his training was in law. Correct me if I'm wrong. So he was a good bullshit artist. He was and to use the British term, an arse kisser, and he slimed his way up the system using those skills. He was a protege of Andropov, which is interesting. Because Andropov was briefly General Secretary, before that, very long time chief of the KGB. Also a senior Soviet diplomat at one stage. So Yuri Andropov is, again, a man who generates a lot of different and varied opinions from various different Marxist sources inside Russia, it seems. I've seen assessments of him done by, I believe, comrades from the KPRF, that judge him as somebody who, had he lived longer, would have been able to carry out positive reforms in the Soviet Union. Some say that he would have taken it in a similar direction to Deng Xiaoping in China. Now, God knows I've got my problems with that, but the favourable analysis of Andropov is that he wanted to reform the system, and had he lived longer, he could have delivered upon successful reforms due to the fact that he commanded an enormous amount of respect across many different factions of the CPSU, and was actually strong theoretically, in a way that Brezhnev wasn't either. I mean, Brezhnev apparently insisted that the speechwriters stopped putting references from Lenin in his speeches because no one would ever believe that he'd read Lenin. But Brezhnev, I think, in the period where he was most able, and I think there's arguments about how unwell he was towards the end of his reign, but certainly Brezhnev was a capable committee man with actually a strong record in the Great Patriotic War. Now he had fought in the war. I think he was a political officer, so he was a man of some skills. Andropov was theoretically pretty strong in terms of Soviet leaders, though of course afflicted with the weaknesses from the sort of the Khrushchev period. But why did he pick out Gorbachev? He didn't just pick out Gorbachev. He picked out Romanov and some others as well, and I believe Ligachev was also somebody he promoted. So it seems that what Andropov was doing, because Romanov, another one who was promoted, I believe, to the Politburo around about the same time as Gorbachev, was also a younger man. And so it seems that Andropov, to my reading of events, was promoting people from different wings of the party into the Politburo. Romanov, more from the left. Gorbachev, where if he was even defined as a figure, seemed to be always more of a sort of a right-wing type, but again, difficult to say given that Gorbachev changed his spots so often. So, but again, that's the technical how he got into the CPSU senior levels. He was promoted by Yuri Andropov. Now, how is somebody so uneducated get that high up? And now this points to a bigger, broader problem, which is that even according to Molotov, that the senior Soviet leaders had been, even in Stalin's time, had gone in the direction of not only neglecting their own political education, but actively avoiding doing it. And this had started to happen I think probably in the years of the war. And what you had in the later Stalin period was, whereas you had people like Molotov and Kaganovich were solid theoretically, I think an awful lot of the others weren't, which is why they were pretty easy prey to revisionism when the revisionists put themselves together and united behind their, well, either leader or puppet, depending upon which point of view you take, in the form of Khrushchev. So there'd been a long-term ideological problem in terms of the political training at the senior levels, and the training for officials in the CPSU had become lax. There was still some good theoretical and historical material being produced within the Soviet Union, I think, right up into the early 80s. I mean, if you look at some of the work by the Soviet theorist Spirkin, for instance, that's some of which is translated into English, you can still get a good education in dialectical materialism by reading some of those books. But at the highest level, I think it had fallen off, and it had become inconsistent. So that you got a Gorbachev figure who apparently had memorized a bunch of Lenin quotes and liked to bring them out to support his point every now and again, but had either not read Lenin properly in terms of Lenin's actual books, or like skimmed it at some point and just liked to deploy quotes every now and again, and was a slick talker. And see, if you had an internal party regime which took theoretical development seriously and took political training up to the highest level seriously, someone like that would get exposed quite quickly. And one of the points that should be emphasized, and I believe that the Chinese do emphasize this now, is that you have to be resolute in insisting that the highest level of the party, the Politburo, has to consist of comrades who are the most advanced theoretically, who are the most theoretically developed, the strongest politically. And if that's not the case, then you're in real trouble. And I think that this was the problem that was identified by Xi Jinping in China. And I've read his comments on the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he does draw a correct conclusion, which is that by the end, the Soviet party just disintegrated. And he locates some of the problem, or a key part of the problem, in the 1956 denunciation of Stalin by Khrushchev, which, for various reasons, the Chinese, even the arch revisionists, were never able to do that to Chairman Mao. The formula that they settled upon was 70% good, 30% bad. And Mao was never demonized, but his old comrades were. So let's be absolutely clear about what happened there. However, to return to the point about theoretical development, if you don't have not just one or two strong, theoretically strong and politically tough comrades in the leadership, but unless you have the great majority of the Politburo who are the politically strongest characters in the party, then you are going to get a Gorbachev. And the Gorbachev comes around because Xi Jinping's point is right, which is in 1956 Khrushchev basically hold the ship below the waterline, because you rip out the entire legacy of Stalin and tarnish it, and you're not just rubbishing Stalin as a man, but you're basically rubbishing the entire period, the entire revolutionary period. And again, this was a tactic that one of Gorbachev's advisors, I believe he was called, funnily enough, Zinoviev, confessed to. I believe it was in one of the books by Medvedev later, Roy Medvedev, the anti-communist author, who Zinoviev confessed that the way they were going about things was to go after Stalin in order to destroy Lenin, and then go after Lenin, go after Stalin, destroy him in order to destroy Lenin, then destroy Lenin with Plekhanov, then destroy Plekhanov with Marx, and then destroy Marx, which is the way the revisionists did go about things. And it took them 30 years to get to the point where they were using Lenin to destroy Leninism. by attacking Stalin. And I think that process did start with Khrushchev, and it starts in 1956, and it starts with them basically upending the entire legacy of the revolutionary period. All of the achievements of the 20s and the 30s and the 40s were called into question, and basically the party's ideological foundations were hollowed out by the revisionists. Now, they weren't able to do all of their work all at once, because Khrushchev ultimately couldn't go the full way that the revisionists wanted him to go, the pro-capitalist tendency wanted him to go, and had to retreat, which ultimately he does, and he's ultimately disposed of. But the revisionists never stopped doing their work, which is making sure that the party becomes more and more hollowed out, because once you take out one of the central pillars, which is the achievements of the Stalin period, then everything else that comes after it, which is built on those achievements, comes into question as well. So the damage done by Khrushchev, and here is one of the reasons I have hope about the future of the Chinese Revolution, is that that Xi Jinping did identify this as one of the central problems. The other central problem, which the Chinese, as far as I know, don't deal with because it brings up problems for them, partly, is that not only was it the fact that the leadership had become opportunistic thanks to the legacy of the Khrushchev period, but also that even when it became clear what Gorbachev was doing, nobody stopped him. And nobody stopped him partially because he was able to purge all of his opponents, his serious opponents, from the higher echelons of the CPSU. So even people like Ligachev were forced out. And it was only him and his clique that were left around, and eventually even his clique was sidelined by, ultimately, the comprador element headed by Yeltsin. So, why did nobody stop him? Why, when it became absolutely obvious after... I mean, my argument always is that as soon as he starts meeting with Reagan and offering all these concessions, it's absolutely clear that something very bad is on the cards. And as soon as the imperialists start praising him to the heavens, it should have been clear that something very bad was happening. And so really by 88, it was obvious what his plan was, though whether it was his or whether it was others in his group who were coming up with this stuff. It was whether we can blame Yakovlev, who may have been, it's fairly certain was a long-term asset of the Central Intelligence Agency. But either way, when it came to the fact that Gorbachev was clearly aiming to destroy the power of the CPSU, because even in its weakened state, it was still a mass organized force of the working class, that a lot of authority, resources, and still some strong cadres who, given proper leadership, would have been prepared to fight to retain socialism. That's why Gorbachev had it lined up to be destroyed. And who better to destroy it than its own general secretary? So by 88, when he starts doing this, that should have been the cue for him to be removed. He should have been removed then. He should never have been appointed in the first place, but he certainly should have been removed as soon as he starts going down the road of destroying the power of the CPSU. As soon as he allowed Yakovlev to turn the official media into an openly anti-socialist sewer, as soon as he allowed Klimov, the man who made Come and See, to destroy the quality standards in Soviet filmmaking, as soon as it became obvious that what he was doing was importing all the filth and all the rot from the West into the Soviet Union at breakneck speed, it should have been clear, indeed was clear to many, many in the Soviet Union, I'm sure, that what he was doing was an active counter-revolution, which is being led by the General Secretary of the party himself. Now, what can stop that is the question. Why it wasn't stopped, because I think that for many people in the Soviet Union, perhaps it was unthinkable what was being done. It was unthinkable that the system could be destroyed by its own leaders. But then again, that's something that Stalin certainly understood, because Stalin was a great revolutionary. Something that Mao understood when Mao said the bourgeoisie is in the party. And the bourgeoisie can occur and reoccur constantly in the party as long as there is a source of bourgeois ideology in the world. and there is a source of bourgeois ideology within a socialist country, or a creation point for bourgeois ideology. And there was in the Soviet Union, thanks to the pro-capitalist measures taken by Khrushchev and continued under Brezhnev by people like Kosygin. So, why does nobody stop him? I mean, this is the question that we keep coming back to. I think, again, to reiterate, partially because I think for a lot of people in the USSR it was unthinkable that this would happen. Partly because their leadership itself, that even those who opposed, like Yegor Ligachev did, who didn't want to see the Soviet Union fall, were also revisionists. And the biggest problem of those who didn't want to see the Soviet Union fall was that they had no concept of what it would take to stop this. And what it would have taken, really, would have been, well, the deposing from power of not just Gorbachev, but Yakovlev as well, and the others in their clique, and their arrest. Because thanks to information that's, again, provided to me by our regular Moscow listener, it's pretty clear that Alexander Yakovlev, who was Gorbachev's head of propaganda, had been recruited as an asset by the Nazis after being taken prisoner on the Leningrad front, around Leningrad in 1942 by the Germans. And what certain historians in Russia now think is that Yakovlev was recruited and then turned loose by the Nazis as an asset. The Nazis kept this on record, but the Nazi records went missing at the end of the war. Most likely a lot of this stuff, because a lot of the personnel from the Nazi intelligence apparatus ended up in the CIA and MI6. What I think happened, and what from the email I've been sent, about this, you can draw the conclusion from this, is that Yakovlev's activities as a man who'd been flipped by the Nazis fell into the hands, or the records fell into the hands of the CIA. So that when Yakovlev went over to the United States in the 50s, his name pops up. The intelligence men in the United States run a check through the files and the records that they've got, and his name pops up. And if you've got that on somebody, then really you've got enough to compel them into doing anything. Interestingly enough, it appears that there were suspicions of him throughout this time. There were suspicions amongst the Soviet intelligence apparatus regarding Yakovlev, but nothing was ever done about him. And again, he's another one who should never have been allowed to have reached that level. And it certainly, when it became clear that he was running an anti-communist campaign from within the hierarchy of the CPSU, he should have been deposed from his position and should have been immediately arrested as a traitor, which is what he was. But again, it doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen, I think, partially because of the failures at leadership level, but also because the Soviet Party had become too I'm trying to find the right word here, too hierarchical, in that its leaders, and even though it had a lot of solid cadres, its leaders had been, of course, actively hostile to the role of the masses within the management of the system for many years. And so what you ideally want in a communist party, especially a mass communist party, and this is something that Stalin wrote about and that Mao spent an awful lot of time wrestling with, what you want is that your cadres should be almost as politically developed, in fact, arguably even more politically developed than the leadership level, because the communist parties are like a weapon in terms of the different elements of them. So if you're making a sword, for instance, we can compare a communist party to a sword. The masses are the blade, and the party hierarchy, the party leadership, is the handle. And a blade without a handle can be dangerous, but mainly perhaps to the person trying to wield it. And a handle without a blade is completely useless. But put the two together and get the two in balance, and you've got a potentially deadly weapon to be wielded against capitalism, against imperialism, against internal reaction. And what the struggles of the 1930s revealed to us, and what the later Cultural Revolution reveals to us, is that when the masses are actually mobilized towards something successfully, when the party gets that, when the party becomes a weapon in the right balance with all the components fitted together well, there is really no force on earth that can stop it. Certainly not the internal plotters of the 1930s, not the Nazis themselves. When it becomes unbalanced, when you have a leadership, certainly after Stalin, that is actively hostile to the masses frequently, that's what defines the Khrushchev leadership, which certainly doesn't seek to mobilize the masses, it seeks to marginalize them. When you get a party where the elected offices in the party and those elected to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR become increasingly drawn from the so-called intelligentsia, from the those conducting mental labor, from those who are the most frequent source of recurring bourgeois tendencies, then you have the means which could remove a leader who is obviously treacherous become compromised themselves, because due to a diminishing amount of proletarians in there were still millions of workers in the CPSU, but increasingly at the upper levels they were all dominated by people who we would call like white collar types, intellectuals, management level people, and that's a big problem, because those people are often the most enthusiastic supporters of revisionism. So they might not have wanted the Soviet Union to end, but many of the people in the Supreme Soviet and other elected bodies were also, objectively speaking, pro-capitalist. Or even though they didn't want the country to collapse, they were still unwilling to act against Gorbachev, because many of them agreed with what he said he wanted to do, not what he was actually doing, what he said he wanted to do. And the other part is, of course, that you need to depose leaders who have gone completely rotten. You need the masses to be organized in such a way as that they can be ready to move to defend their revolution, which the masses, although there were many demonstrations in favor of keeping the Soviet Union, in favor of preserving it, they were all out there in the streets of Moscow and Leningrad, appealing to who? Who was the appeal being made to by all these demonstrations that did take place? Some of which were many, many hundreds of thousands strong. Were you appealing to what? Gorbachev, who was openly plotting for the Soviet Union's destruction? To Yeltsin? The appeal was still being made to the leaders, a leadership group which was both a combination of treacherous and cowardly. Treacherous in the form of Gorbachev and certainly Yeltsin, but then cowardly, divided and weak when it came to almost everybody else in it. So the masses were left without leaders and were left without the ability to generate a new leadership themselves. Like for the communist parties to work, you need not only the workers to be in the driving seat in every representative body in it, and in the state, which is what Stalin was striving to do, what the Stalin era leadership was striving to do with the Lenin intake in the 1920s, which is they were actively working to proletarianize the party, to make sure it wasn't dominated by officials and managers, to bring in low-level workers into it, which I'm told by various accounts of the DPRK that this is still something that is successfully done there. But again, that stopped being done in the later Stalin period due to the damage and disruption of the war, and certainly in the Khrushchev period, you got an increased managerialization of the party, an increased bureaucratization of the party. Whereas following Mao, where we know very well that is a source of bourgeois ideology and counter-revolution, so it proves. So that's a rather long answer there, but I think what I want to narrow it down to there, in response to Jason's question, is that he's able to reach the top due to the fact that there had been a long-term theoretical and political degeneration in the leadership of the CPSU, and he was able to stay at the top because the hierarchy had become dominated by other revisionists who weren't prepared to take the ruthless proletarian action that was required to remove a rogue leader like that. And this is the reason why they survived, because the Soviet proletariat, almost as one, were completely opposed to what happened, but they had no leadership or means of mobilizing in a serious way. They were all waiting. I mean, you remember when we did the program on the August coup, and I read some excerpts from a party secretary who was sat there waiting for orders to come from the Central Committee, and the orders never came. And the sad thing is that the honest men in the CPSU were themselves, although they were wanting to preserve the party and the state, these men themselves were not politically strong enough, because they're still waiting for a lead from a leadership which has gone rotten and which has already made it pretty clear that it wants to sideline and destroy the CPSU, and yet even the honest cadres of it are still sat there waiting for an order from Moscow. So therein lies your problem at these three levels: theoretical and political degeneration, political weakness bred through years of revisionism, a deproletarianization of the party at the highest level, and a loss of revolutionary spirit in the training of even the honest worker cadres of the CPSU, who, again, as I said, the worker cadres in any party need to be very strong politically, as well as having very strong links to the working class, to the point where if the leadership goes rotten, just as the bourgeois do if their political leadership goes rotten, if the political leadership of the proletariat goes rotten, and the proletariat can mobilize itself using the party structures to arrest and remove a clique that's posing a danger to the party and the state, as the Gorbachev clique were. As I said, they should have been removed with great ruthlessness by 1988. Had that been done, things could have been stopped. But as it was, everybody just kept waiting for an order from somebody that, of course, never came. Because if the head of the organization is a traitor, then you're going to be waiting a very long time for an order to do something positive, given that he actively wants to destroy the party and the state. And the more Russian sources I read on this, the more I am absolutely convinced that Gorbachev was an active traitor. Whether he always was, or whether he became under the influence of Yakovlev, who was certainly a CIA agent and in the past a Nazi agent, it doesn't really matter. Objectively speaking, the man's whole period in office was every single action that he took was dedicated to destroying the party and the state, and ultimately he succeeded in that, unfortunately. Final question from Comrade Jason, who asks, what do I think of the Brezhnev period? Well, kind of links on with the previous question, really, but just briefly on Brezhnev. Again, like a symptom of a wider problem, was the man who came out on top in the struggle to depose Khrushchev. But, again, nowhere near as bad as Gorbachev, of course, but again, was part of the problem in that he continued the revisionist drift of Khrushchev to a certain extent, in that there were more pro-capitalist so-called reforms, in reality counter-reforms carried out, certainly by people like Kosygin, and this bred more and more of a bourgeois element within the party, especially in organizations like the Komsomol, which more and more started aping Western styles and Western tendencies. And in Brezhnev's period, more Western-influenced methods came in completely uncritically into a lot of state management structures in the Soviet Union as well. At the same time, you have to give credit to the leadership during this period. I mean, if you actually go away, you actually read something like the Soviet Constitution of 1977, it seems incredibly strong. And again, there was still some good theoretical work being done by the ideological section in the party and by party historians. There was still strong work being produced up to the early 1980s with regard to this. Industrially speaking, mean, the Brezhnev period has to be credited with the ability of the Russian Federation to remain a sovereign state to this day, because they did put a hell of a lot of effort into resources into catching up with the West in terms of nuclear weapons production. Now, this is blamed for the collapse of the USSR. I think that's a kind of explanation at all. I think that the catching up with the imperialists in terms of nuclear weapons was probably a necessity, given that the only way they're going to be made to think twice is if you're able to destroy them as much as they are able to destroy you. So I think from that point of view, Brezhnev's policy, or the policy in the Brezhnev period, was completely justified. As for Brezhnev's other actions that are positive, I regard the crushing of that rat Dubček's so-called Prague Spring as a positive thing. It was the Czech communists themselves who appealed for Soviet intervention, and it's to Brezhnev's credit that he came through with that. Though, again, it must be said that the balance in the Politburo in the 60s and 70s seems to have been much stronger in terms of support for a more revolutionary line, certainly, than came later. So the other point, though, and here we go back to the negative, is that during this time, of course, the black market continued to grow in the Soviet Union, corruption continued to grow, the role of the working class in managing the economy, the party, and the state got diminished even further. There was a more depoliticization of the working class, which of course leads to severe problems in the next decade to come in the 80s. So a mixed bag at best. Some positive elements continued a lot of the negative revisionist trends of the Khrushchev period, and ultimately leads to the Gorbachev period. So in the end, it has to be viewed negatively, even though Brezhnev as a man was clearly a more able representative of the Soviet officialdom than some of his successors were, but ultimately has to be judged harshly, because even with the positive things that happened in his era, look at where it led. Look at all the weaknesses that grew up in that period. Look at the bureaucratic management style that was adopted. Look at the fact that they kept trying to depoliticize the Soviet working class. All of those are severe crimes, in my view. Right. Let's catch up on some questions or comments from the floor. Right. Going back up to the top. Hope you enjoyed the men they couldn't hang there, and shirt of blue. Edward still wants the Latvian communist music. Well, I've got to keep you watching somehow, so I'm going to withhold that for now. It is in the pipeline, though. Edward says, you said that all the USSR's republic leaders had gone rotten by the time of Gorbachev's reforms. That's not true. Alfred Rubik in the Latvian SSR held out till the March 1990 referendums. Until March 1990. Yeah, I say, was it you that posted a link about him in the Telegram group? I've yet to read it, but I will certainly read about him. Let's just scroll through, see what comments we've got here. Nikki Const says, or asks, what's the real story regarding Nicolae Ceausescu? Well, Ceausescu is another one. Very flawed man. Led a very flawed leadership period in Romania. That being said, the Romanian socialism did achieve a great deal, even with all the mistakes that Ceausescu undoubtedly made, one of the biggest of which was getting into debt with the fucking IMF. Though Ceausescu's government was in a position where it could have paid that off towards the end of the 80s. The thing with Ceausescu, as is this case with other characters of the time, such as Todor Zivkov, these were condemned by the so-called Western left at the time. But again, we stand now over 30 years since Ceausescu's death, and for all of his mistakes, and undoubtedly he was a revisionist, He did die for socialism. He faced his death with dignity and bravery, and apparently went out whistling the tune from the International. So full credit to him there. And look at what has happened to Romania since his death, since the removal of socialism. It's turned into a vassal state of the USA. It's been deindustrialized. The population is just used as cheap labor by imperialist powers now. We can judge a man's legacy partly from what happens after he's gone. And if we look at what happened to Romania after the removal of socialism, then Ceausescu's legacy, with all of the undoubted problems stemming from his revisionism that it did have, looks a hell of a lot better than in comparison to what has followed it. And so Ceausescu, I mean, I don't know how he's viewed in Romania now, but I imagine a re-evaluation of him is probably went underway pretty quickly. Now, as to why he was overthrown, I think we've said before that, again, it's a classic case of like what became to be the standard moves in a colour revolution, right up to and including mysterious snipers opening fire on opposition crowds and killing people, corpses being taken out of morgues and left on the street to set it up to look as if Ceausescu had murdered all these people, or Ceausescu's security forces had murdered all these people. Later on, I believe one of the generals who was involved in the counter-revolution was actually prosecuted for these sniper incidents. The exact same methodology, by the way, was deployed in Ukraine in 2014. Mysterious snipers gunning people down on both sides of the protest and the state forces in order to build tensions. So it's a standard CIA MI6 move. That's one of the things that was done there. And the removal of him was a counter-revolution carried through by a corrupt group in the bureaucracy, headed by some army generals and others. That's a very brief way of summing that up. I'm scrolling through the comments here. I'm not going to get to all of them. Abtin says, if the peasants in Afghanistan were behind the revolution, it wouldn't be much of a debate. Yeah, that's true. They'd won the peasantry over, or at least a significant minority of the peasantry over, and if the revolution had embedded itself in the countryside, then there's no way the US could have won. There's no way that the counter-revolutionaries could have won that war. President Jesus says, Timothy Dalton and his Mujahideen friends on horseback won that war. I swear I'm not propagandized. Yeah, and he can have a fight on the back of a transport plane clinging onto a net as it flies through the air. And he can ski down a ski slope on a cello case. I enjoyed the hell out of that film when I was a kid. I also had the Sinclair Spectrum game for it. There you go. That gives you an indication as to like when I grew up, in the late 80s. Harold says the USA invaded Afghanistan through Pakistan using terrorists in 1978. The Supreme Soviet debated a long time and only reluctantly sent in troops in the end of 1979. Good comment, good point there. Svetlana says, my father served in Afghanistan. He and his comrades in arms never felt they lost in Afghanistan. That's not just his bias. He took a very sober view of things. Gorbachev pulled out our troops as a goodwill gesture to the US. Jesus, they say the good die young and the bad live to wretched old age. I wish that Gorbachev was troubled by his conscience to the end of his life, but I bet he wasn't. Svetlana says, for certain heinous crimes, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation is in favour of capital punishment. Anthony asks, could a sustainable revolution happen in Britain? No industrial proletariat. There is one. It's smaller, but it's still there. Disgruntled software engineers, half-starved single mothers on 0-hour contracts. That's not a pit. Well, there's certain elements of truth in what you say there. I know you're not based here anymore, but there are industrial workers in Britain. It's just that there's not as many of them as there used to be. There are people in, manual jobs in this country. There is a proletariat in this country. It's not miners and steel workers anymore, but it's still there. So yes, it could happen. I mean, we shouldn't don't fall into the trap of getting stuck in thinking that because the composition of the proletariat has changed, it can't do anything. It can. Like we saw even in small form, like when train drivers walk out, when transport workers stop things, even when certain elements of the public sector takes action, it has a severe impact on the nation, and that's why the ruling class then freaks out and brings in even more anti-union laws. Like, if there was no proletariat that could have any conceivable impact on them, they wouldn't bother with all the anti-union laws and the threats to lock people up in perpetuity for tweeting the wrong way. So I disagree with your characterization of that. Not only can it happen, it must happen. Last execution in Russia was in 1996, says Svetlana. Scrolling through the comments here. Thomas Klaus says, I read in many webs that Gorbachev was a Western spy, just like Yakovlev. What do you think about that? And why weren't they investigated and taken out, just like Trotsky and Khrushchev? Well, I think I've answered that question already. I mean, weakness and degeneration of the leadership and the middle layers in the Soviet party and state, I think. But I mean, that's what should have been done. I mean, these people. There is a reason why the bourgeois freak out all the time about the Cultural Revolution and also the purges of the 1930s. Is because they worked. Like, especially, I mean, the Cultural Revolution mixed legacy. But I mean, we can go into that in another episode. But the purges of the fifth column in the army and the purges of the party leadership in the CPSU in the 30s did prevent a counter-revolution. It did uproot Western spies. It's why they cry so much about Chinese repression now, because the Chinese wrapped up a load of their intelligence networks. The only way to deal with traitors is to arrest them and imprison them, and if they're particularly severe, execute them. I mean, Gorbachev should have ended these days like Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Trotsky did, which is should have been arrested, put on trial, the full scope of his collaboration with the imperialists put on display in front of the Soviet proletariat, and then he should have been executed, if we're going back to the death penalty. Then I don't say that lightly. I say that because this is the man who is responsible for the suffering and death of millions upon millions, and whose legacy is still killing people to this day in Ukraine. That's his legacy. It's the imperialists who have done it, but again, it's all possible. A lot of it is possible because of him and his collaborators and his clique. So it's should have been absolutely justified to grab all his clique up. The KGB, if it had been doing its fucking job, which under Khrushchev it stopped doing, I think, should have scooped all these guys up and had them imprisoned. But again, too many problems, too much corruption, too much bureaucracy, too much ideological weakness, too much organizational dysfunction, all of which combines together to deadly effect in that, and also too many people thought that it could never happen. So a traitor could get away with committing a heinous act, which is haunting us to this day. Sid says, some Nazis are true believers. You can and cannot be reformed, no matter how much you empower or educate them. Very true. The West always exaggerated about the purges and the gulags. That's true. Albert Witch Wiggler says, what else can one do when one's leadership has been penetrated by those who'd see it all burn? Well, yes, there is that, but then again, those people were always present. I mean, there was always a revisionist wing of the CPSU. I mean, the ideas that Gorbachev spouted off had been around for a long time. They'd been around in embryonic form since the 20s. So why was the party in the 1930s able to suppress this successfully, and it wasn't able to do so afterwards? Those are questions which must be addressed. So yes, the imperialists will try and destroy your system. Of course they will. But again, like with a strong enough leadership, with a strong enough connection with the masses able to be mobilized, then you can counteract all of this. We've seen it done. The fact is that the methods by which it was counteracted were systematically dismantled from the 50s onwards. Sid Hatfield says, apparently US intelligence runs a rat line of their endangered Chinese assets, somehow through Central America and Mexico to the Rio Grande. Yeah, I mean, you do wonder why quite a number of Chinese do turn up there. And I think it's... I mean, it may well be what you say. I wonder why they don't just take them out. I mean, they used to take them out through Hong Kong when it was occupied by the British. But perhaps a way of getting them into the US is to have them go to South America and then travel up. A way of maintaining some element of plausible deniability, perhaps. It wouldn't surprise me if that was what they were doing. Because you do wonder where all the Chinese people who are popping up on the Mexican border are coming from. Because whatever else is going on in China, it's no doubt that that society is taking great strides forward. So, again, like, who's emigrating? Probably around about the same collection of people who used to flee to the West from the USSR. Rats, traitors, spies, people who've got caught out and want to run away. That's their way in. Bean says, the difference between bourgeois justice and proletarian justice is that under capitalism we workers cannot do well. Under a communist system the former bourgeois can do as long as they behave. Good point. Very good point. Klavek says, the United States is the world's largest prison state. Ridiculous to complain about gulags. That is true. Svetlana says, I don't wish to be pedantic, but there is no such thing as plural gulags, only the gulag, singular. It means the system itself, not the individual camps. Fair comment. Peter has an intractable aversion to the death penalty. Well, your mind may change dependent upon the situation. The only thing I'd say to you is this. Many of us grow up with an intractable opposition to it, because we grew up in an imperialist system where it will only ever be used against the worker. It will never be used against the most serious criminals in society because they all exist in the ruling class. But should we take power and should we need to defend ourselves against the despicable scum that they will unleash against us, then we should reevaluate our opposition. Hello from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, says the Wicked Witch of SE. As usual, I missed the beginning of the show. Most of the time I missed the whole show. I have seen that Andropov would have kept to the line described. Interesting. Thomas Klaus says Andropov was a guerrilla leader during World War II. Yeah, he had a impressive record in many respects. I mean, I still need to read more about him. Again, opinion on him inside Russia seems very split. Right, just scrolling through. Thomas Klaus says Yakovlev wrote in the Black Book of Communism that the biggest illusion of his life, or do you mean ambition of his life, was to destroy socialism. Gorbachev in Turkey said something along similar lines. Yeah, I used to doubt that, but I think that there's given, as Krasovet says in the next comment down, that the British ruling class made sure that Gorbachev was well paid for the rest of his life. I mean, there's no doubt that he aimed for the destruction of the system. Like, he did so many things which blew up so many tensions and problems that did exist in a way that could only guarantee total collapse. That I'm left with no other conclusion to draw, and that he was some kind of agent of the West. I mean, Yakovlev certainly was, and Yakovlev was, I think, his handler. The Wicked Witch says, I've tried contacting the American Communist Party to no avail. Not big on Midwestern Marx either. I searched for ID poll as my first order and certainly found it there. Have not liked what I've seen in YouTube videos. I don't know what the ACP's development stage is at the moment, but if you're interested, then I would say keep trying. As I've said before, I view it as a positive development. If I were American, I would certainly get involved in it. Sid Atfield says, what I suspect was a sabotage operation at Chernobyl in '86 was effectively utilized to discredit Soviet leadership, perhaps more so domestically than internationally. I hadn't heard about that, that it might have been sabotage. I'm anxious to read more about it if you have any sources on that. Sid Hatfield says the CPSU reached peak proletarian membership in its leadership positions under Stalin. It tailed off after that to a great detriment. Indeed, indeed. What's interesting, says Harold, comparing what the West calls democracy to the Soviet system, you notice that the people in the Soviet government were from the workers and peasantry. In the USA, the senators and representatives are exclusively from old money. Very true. Well, I've answered the question on the Soviet-Afghan war, so I'm gonna scroll down a little bit further. Speculation as to whether Nasrallah has been killed in an Israeli airstrike or not. I know that the Iranians were claiming he was alive and well. I haven't seen any confirmation on that yet, so I'm not going to speculate any further. But bear in mind what I said last night. This is a struggle for the domination of the whole of the West Asian region. So we should remember that when the Israelis act, they are acting on behalf of US and British imperialism, which is why the US and the British are backing them up every step of the way. There is no doubt in my mind about that. Mouse SF said, I was honoured to perform in Moscow during the Serbian war. Let me go on the radio to promote peace through culture, not war. Such an honour. Well, this has been a very interesting experience for you, comrade. Good on you. Rista Costadino says, Najibullah was pretty effective in dealing with the Mujahideen. Again, need to read more about it myself. Penguin says on the Bond movies, these are the dreams of a little boy, driving fast cars, sleeping with beautiful women, beating up men, firing guns and saving the world. Well, yeah, that's why I watch them. Aziz says, the fact that Gorbachev was welcomed in the West with open arms is evidence he was a traitor. Yeah, I think I got a while ago, I kind of got lost in the semantics of it about whether he was had an employment contract with MI6 or not. Judge him by his actions and who he's rewarded by. His actions were treasonous. Whether he was tapped on the shoulder by, a guy who looked like Alec Guinness in the George Smiley series, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, or whether he was just a fool and he was pushed around into various different situations by a man who was an active traitor, Yakovlev, either way, that's treacherous. And either way, he should have been arrested. Rob says the power of the industrial workers in Britain is concentrated in fewer hands, which, if anything, gives them more power. It's a very good way of putting it, Rob. Going down. Sid Atfield says, purging the Red Army of former Tsarist officers in 1937, a wise move. Yeah, and there's evidence that people like Tukhachevsky was not just pro-German, but the guy had like serious, like bizarre fascist beliefs that he would sort of share those with people in his inner circle. So like, had those guys remained where they were, then Hitler's calculation about kicking in the door and the structure falling in would have been right. The purge of the Red Army leadership actually strengthened the Red Army. It enabled new and much better commanders who weren't traitors to come through. Rista Kostadinov says, that's why people who like to talk about totalitarianism and one man having all the power, nobody can explain how there are party cadres in all communist parties who have been doing things out the party line. All of these historians look silly. These historians aren't historians, they're propagandists. You can never be out of work in Western academia if you're prepared to write dumb shit about the Soviet Union or China. Aziz says, that's why I get pissed off at Chris Hedges. Says Gorbachev was a humanitarian and a good man. Well, Chris Hedges is one dubious bastard, to be blunt. Certainly, one would say at the very least he's a member of the compatible left in the United States. Well, Anthony, just coming back on your question about the British proletariat. Yeah, it's changed, and I would be a fool if I denied that we don't have severe problems relating to deindustrialization and atomization. The objective reality, though, will reassert itself, which is that not only is the vast majority of the British population proletarian, but even though those bits of it that are better off are getting more and more impoverished all the time. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to turn to communism. Nothing automatically follows. B does not necessarily follow A here, if we're doing equations or algebra. But the fact is that the delicate social peace that the British ruling class bought themselves since World War II by essentially bribing a giant layer of the labour aristocracy and keeping them on side and keeping the trade unions and the alleged working class political representation in the hands of Labour Party traitors and scabs, and the trade unions in the hands of scabs then who are very well paid and rewarded for their positions, for their control and policing of the working class. Their ability to do all of that is coming to a close. And again, I think your question does lead me in the direction of wanting to do a whole series on class composition in Britain. We may come back to this. But yes, their ability to keep the situation under control is slowly coming to an end. Our job is to build ourselves in every working class community that we can now. Jenny says, apparently these Chinese immigrants have money and were able to afford the easiest access. Yeah, I think that backs up Sid's point about them probably being people who are either US intelligence assets or dodgy bastards who are fleeing some sort of crime they've committed. Because if they're being let in ultra easy, then it says to me that they are people who have provided some service or another to the US. Aziz says, apparently Narishkin knew 9/11 was an inside job, then why did Putin offer US help against Afghanistan? Because at the time, the balance of forces within the Russian government was still such that they desperately wanted to reach an accommodation with US imperialism. That's why. I mean, Putin had to, I think, overrule like his military and intelligence men who were completely opposed to collaborating with the US over Afghanistan. Notice how, though, that 6 years later that changed again, because Putin then delivers the Munich speech in 2007, basically giving them a warning, saying, we tried to cooperate with you, but you insist on domination, and we won't have it. So it's the matter of the evolving nature of the hierarchy in the Russian government, that the coalition of forces in 2001 is much more comprador than the coalition of forces around Putin in 2007. And the comprador element steadily gets more and more sidelined, partially because of the hostile actions of US imperialism itself. Dmitry says Bolsheviks did abolish the death penalty in the very beginning, even let their enemies go after some time, just taking their word not to fight against the revolution. It didn't work. No, it never does. Nehat says Gorbachev acted as a photo model for Samsonite bags in the 2000s. That must be good pay. Yeah, you provide services to imperialism, you'll get an endless round of paydays. And certainly he provided them with one of the biggest services of all time. Yes, it is okay, to answer Mouse's point, for communists to enjoy Die Hard movies. Hey, look, Die Hard's a fun movie, you know? I've always enjoyed it myself. Right, okay. Alan, you'll need to rewrite your question, because I couldn't understand what you're on about there. Okay, right. We are hitting the 9:10 mark here. I'm going to draw things to a close for this evening. I hope you've enjoyed this Q&A session. Tomorrow, please join me for the latest in our Stalin series, where we'll be looking at his analysis of the opposition at the 14th Congress of the CPSU. So the best period, shall we say, or one of the best periods in the CPSU. All right, well, thank you everybody for tuning in. Enjoy the weekend you've got in front of you. And thank you to everybody who supports the show on Patreon, where we are now up to date with the uploads on there. And also everybody who supports the show on Buy Me a Coffee. I'll be back again with you tomorrow, and on Sunday we'll have the latest in our series on the Marxist analysis of World War II, where we'll be looking at the origins of so-called race science. So please join me for that one. Until then, though, thank you for watching, and good evening.
Praha, Československé zahraniční vysílání.
miền biển xa, người đi khắp phương trời. Ở nơi xa đó, người dân đói nghèo, từ đau thương người đi khắp năm châu, lòng tin mặt trời chân lý sáng soi, dõi chiếu sáng dân mình. Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh. Vượt trùng sông, người đi khắp phương trời, luyện tôi ý chí, lòng núi căm hờn. Hồ Chí Minh, người đi khắp năm châu, lòng tin mặt trời chân lý sáng soi, dọi chiếu sáng dân mình. Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh. Miền biển xa, người đi khắp phương trời. Ở nơi xa đó, người dân đói nghèo, từ đau thương người đi khắp năm châu, lòng tin mặt trời chân lý sáng soi, rồi chiếu sáng dân mình. Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh. Vượt trùng sông, người đi khắp phương trời, luyện tôi ý chí, lòng núi căm hờn. Hồ Chí Minh, người đi khắp năm châu, lòng tin mặt trời chân lý sáng soi, rồi chiếu sáng dân mình. Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh. Miền Đông, sao tắt nơi chân trời. Ở nơi xa đó, người dân đói nghèo, từ đau thương người đi khắp năm châu, lòng tin mặt trời chân lý sáng.